She answered one wrong number, became his phone confidant and the woman he desperately hungered to find. The fluorescent lights in the community crisis center hummed their familiar tune as Sky Price rubbed her tired eyes, glancing at the clock that read 2:47 in the morning. 12 hours. She'd been fielding calls for 12 straight hours, and her voice felt raw from talking desperate souls through their darkest moments. The coffee in her ceramic mug had long since grown cold, but she wrapped her hands around it anyway, seeking whatever warmth she could find in this sterile room that had become her second home. Outside, the October rain drummed against the windows with relentless persistence, matching the exhaustion that had settled into her bones. At 34, Sky had learned to recognize when her emotional reserves were running on empty, and tonight she was scraping the bottom of that well. Just 15 more minutes, she told herself. 15 minutes until Maya Anderson arrived for the graveyard shift, and she could finally drive home to her small apartment where 17-year-old Sasha Price would be fast asleep, probably with homework scattered across her desk and her phone charging on the nightstand. The shrill ring of the crisis line jolted Sky from her thoughts, her hand automatically reaching for the receiver before her mind had fully engaged. This was muscle memory now, this immediate response to someone else's pain. She cleared her throat and lifted the phone to her ear, her voice sliding into the warm, professional tone that had comforted hundreds of callers over the past 3 years. But the voice that met her ears was different from the usual calls. Deep, rich, and trembling with a vulnerability that seemed to surprise even the speaker himself. "Please don't hang up." The words rushed out in a breath that sounded like a man drowning. "I know this is wrong, but I don't know who else to call." 43 floors above the sleeping city, Matthew Bennett stood in his corner office at Bennett Investment Group, his expensive suit jacket discarded on the leather chair behind him, his usually perfectly styled dark hair disheveled from running his hands through it. The panic attack had hit him like a freight train, just as he'd been reviewing quarterly reports that would determine the fate of 300 employees. His chest felt tight, his breathing shallow, and his hands shook as he gripped the phone that he'd intended to use to call his therapist's emergency line. But somewhere in his panic, he'd misdialed. Instead of reaching Dr. Morrison's answering service, he'd connected to something called a crisis hotline. The irony wasn't lost on him that in his moment of crisis, he'd found exactly what he needed. "You've reached someone who wants to listen," Sky said softly, her voice like honey over gravel, worn smooth by years of offering comfort to strangers. Something about the genuine desperation in the caller's voice made her lean forward in her chair, abandoning her usual script. "What's your name?" Matthew started, then stopped. He never gave his real name. In his world, names meant liability, meant weakness that could be exploited. But something about the woman's voice made him want to be honest. "Matthew. My name is Matthew." "Hello, Matthew. I'm Sky, and I'm glad you called." She meant it, which surprised her. After 12 hours of crisis intervention, she should have been emotionally drained, but something about this man's voice sparked a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. "Can you tell me what's happening right now?" Matthew's breath came in sharp bursts as he looked out at the city lights blurring through his floor-to-ceiling windows. "I can't breathe properly. My chest feels like someone's sitting on it, and my hands won't stop shaking. I was working late, and suddenly I couldn't handle it anymore." Sky closed her eyes, letting his voice wash over her. There was something about the cadence of his speech, the way he pronounced certain words, that suggested education and privilege, but the raw fear underneath was universal. Pain didn't discriminate based on bank account balances. "Matthew, I want you to do something for me," she said, her voice dropping to an even softer register. "Can you find a comfortable place to sit down?" "I'm already sitting," he replied, though comfortable was hardly the word he'd use for his current state. "Good. Now, I want you to focus on my voice and breathe with me." "Can you do that?" She waited for his quiet yes before continuing. "In through your nose for 4 counts. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now out through your mouth for 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As Matthew followed her guidance, something miraculous happened. The crushing weight on his chest began to lift, replaced by the gentle anchor of this stranger's voice. He found himself focusing not just on the breathing technique, but on the way she spoke, the slight rasp that suggested she'd been talking for hours, the hint of warmth that made him feel less alone in his glass tower. "That's perfect, Matthew," Sky murmured after they'd breathed together for several minutes. "You're doing beautifully. How are you feeling now?" "Better," he admitted, and it was true. The panic had receded like a tide, leaving him feeling raw but no longer drowning. "Much better. Thank you." There was something in the way he said those two words that made Sky's pulse quicken. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe that a stranger's voice had pulled him back from the edge. "I'm glad," she said, and found herself smiling for the first time all night. Panic attacks can feel overwhelming, but they do pass. "You handled that really well." "I don't usually." Matthew started, then trailed off. "He didn't usually what? Break down? Show weakness? Call crisis lines? All of the above, really. I don't usually fall apart like that." "Everyone falls apart sometimes," Sky said gently. "It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." The simple acceptance in her words hit Matthew like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had spoken to him without agenda, without wanting something from him? His mother, Mrs. Sarah Bennett, called only to discuss his social obligations and marriage prospects. His brother David Bennett treated every conversation like a business meeting. His few friends were really business associates who saw him as a networking opportunity. But this woman's Sky spoke to him like he was just a person in need of kindness. "Can I ask you something?" Matthew said, settling back in his chair and loosening his tie. The crisis had passed, but he found himself reluctant to end the call. "Of course. Do you ever wonder about the people who call you? I mean, after you hang up, do you think about what happens to them?" Sky was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Professional boundaries said she should redirect this conversation, should offer resources and wrap up the call. But there was something about Matthew's voice that made her want to be honest. "Sometimes," she admitted. "More than I probably should. There are voices that stay with you, you know? People who touch your heart in just a few minutes of conversation. Am I one of those voices?" The question slipped out before Matthew could stop it, vulnerable and hopeful in a way that would have horrified his business associates. Sky felt her cheeks warm, grateful that phone calls couldn't convey blushes. "You have a very memorable voice, Matthew." They talked for another 20 minutes, the conversation drifting from crisis management to life in general. Matthew found himself sharing stories about growing up in the shadow of family expectations, while Sky spoke about the satisfaction of helping people find their way through difficult moments. Neither of them mentioned specific details, no last names, no addresses, no identifying information, but somehow they managed to create an intimacy that felt both safe and electric. When Maya Anderson's key turned in the lock of the crisis center, Sky realized with a start that her replacement had arrived. "I need to go," she said reluctantly, watching Maya hang up her rain-dampened coat and wave in her direction. "Of course," Matthew said, though he felt a strange sense of loss at the thought of losing this connection. "Thank you again, Sky. For everything. Take care of yourself, Matthew," she said softly. "And remember, you're stronger than you think you are." After the call ended, both Matthew and Sky sat in their respective spaces, staring at their phones and wondering what had just happened. Neither could shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in their world, though neither could quite name what it was. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. 3 days later, as Sky settled into her evening shift at the crisis center, she found herself glancing at the phone more frequently than usual. Maya Anderson had noticed her distraction during their shift change, raising an eyebrow at Sky's obvious disappointment when the crisis line remained silent. "Expecting someone special?" Maya had teased, her dark eyes twinkling with mischief. Maya had been Sky's closest friend since they'd started working at the center together, and she had an annoying habit of seeing straight through Sky's attempts at emotional detachment. "It's not like that," Sky had protested, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. She had been hoping Matthew would call again, had been wondering if his panic attacks were a recurring issue, had been telling herself that her concern was purely professional. She was a terrible liar, even to herself. At 11:30, the phone rang. Sky's heart jumped as she reached for it, her voice carefully modulated to hide her anticipation. "Crisis support line, this is Sky." "Hi, Sky. It's Matthew. From the other night." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she had to take a steadying breath. "Matthew. How are you feeling?" "Better. Much better, actually. I wanted to thank you again for talking me through that panic attack. I don't think I properly expressed how much it meant to me." There was something different about his voice tonight. The panic was gone, replaced by a warm confidence that made Sky's pulse quicken. She could picture him smiling as he spoke, though she had no idea what he looked like. "I'm glad I could help," she said. "Are you calling because you're having another difficult night?" Matthew was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was a hint of embarrassment in his voice. "Honestly? No. I'm calling because I haven't been able to stop thinking about our conversation." Is that wrong of me?" Sky glanced around the empty crisis center, grateful that she was alone. "Matthew, I should probably tell you that this line is really meant for people who are in immediate crisis situations." "I know," he said quickly. "I know, and I'm sorry. I dialed your number 3 times tonight and hung up before it could ring because I knew I shouldn't be calling. But I can't get your voice out of my head, Sky. The way you made me feel like I mattered, like I was worth listening to. I haven't felt that in a very long time." The honesty in his admission made Sky's throat tight with emotion. She thought about protocol, about professional boundaries, about all the reasons she should politely redirect this call and hang up. But she also thought about the genuine gratitude in his voice, the way he'd trusted her with his vulnerability, the strange connection that had formed between them in the space of a single conversation. "What do you do, Matthew?" she asked, making a decision that went against every professional guideline she'd ever learned. "For work, I mean." If Matthew was surprised by her willingness to continue the conversation, he didn't show it. "I work in investments. Family business. Very boring, very corporate." "What about you? Besides being a guardian angel for people having breakdowns in the middle of the night?" Sky laughed, a sound that seemed to travel through the phone line and settle warmly in Matthew's chest. "I'm a crisis counselor, obviously. But during the day, I'm a single mom trying to keep a 17-year-old from making all the same mistakes I did at her age." 17, Matthew mused. "That's a challenging age. You have experience with teenagers?" "God, no," Matthew said, and Sky could hear the smile in his voice. "But I remember being 17 and thinking I knew everything about everything." "I'm sure I drove my parents crazy." They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing with an ease that surprised them both. Matthew told her about the pressure of living up to family expectations, about taking over a business he'd never really wanted to run. Sky shared stories about Sasha Price, about the challenges of raising a teenager while working nights, about the satisfaction of helping people through their worst moments. Neither of them mentioned last names or specific details about their lives, but somehow they managed to create a picture of each other that felt intimate and real. Matthew had never met anyone who listened the way Sky did, with complete attention and without judgment. Sky had never encountered someone who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings, who asked follow-up questions and remembered details from previous conversations. When they finally hung up, both of them sat in the quiet afterward, wondering what they'd gotten themselves into. Over the next 2 weeks, the calls became a routine. Matthew would call just as Sky's evening shift was winding down, and they would talk until Maya Anderson arrived to take over. The conversations ranged from light and playful to deep and meaningful, creating a connection that neither of them had experienced before. Matthew found himself rearranging his schedule around those calls, leaving business dinners early and declining social invitations that would interfere with his 11:30 phone dates with Sky. His brother David Bennett had noticed the change in his demeanor, commenting on Matthew's improved mood and increased focus during board meetings. "Whatever you're doing differently, keep doing it," David had said just that afternoon. "You seem, I don't know, more like yourself lately." Matthew had merely smiled and changed the subject, but David's words stuck with him. More like himself. It was true, talking to Sky made him feel like the person he'd been before. Years of corporate pressure and family expectations had worn him down to sharp edges and careful responses. Sky, for her part, found herself looking forward to work in a way she hadn't in years. The other calls still drained her, still required every ounce of professional compassion she possessed, but knowing that Matthew would call at the end of her shift gave her something to anticipate. She caught herself checking her reflection in the bathroom mirror before his calls, which was ridiculous since he couldn't see her, but somehow she wanted to look her best for their conversations. Maya Anderson had definitely noticed the change in her friend's behavior. "Okay, spill," Maya said one evening as she arrived for her shift and found Sky practically glowing. "Who is he?" "Who is who?" Sky asked, though her attempt at innocence fell flat. "The man who's got you smiling like you just won the lottery. And don't try to deny it, you've been floating around here like you're walking on clouds for 2 weeks." Sky felt her cheeks warm. "It's not what you think. So there is someone." Maya settled into the chair across from Sky's desk, clearly prepared for a full interrogation. "Details." "Now." "It's just, there's this caller. Matthew. He's been calling regularly, and we've developed a good rapport." Maya's eyebrows shot up. "A caller? Sky, please tell me you're not getting involved with someone from the crisis line." "It's not like that," Sky protested, even as she realized how weak that sounded. "He's not really in crisis anymore. We talk." "You just talk," Maya repeated flatly. "About what?" "Life. Work. His family. My daughter. Everything and nothing." "Maya, I know how it sounds, but there's something special about him. He makes me feel." "Feel what?" Sky struggled to find the words. "Heard. Appreciated. Like I'm interesting and worth talking to, not just someone whose job it is to listen to problems." Maya's expression softened slightly, but concern still creased her features. "Honey, you don't even know this man. He could be anyone. Married, dangerous, completely different from who he says he is." "I know," Sky said quietly. "I know all of that. But Maya, when we talk, it's like finding something I didn't even know I was looking for." "What do you think, should Sky maintain professional boundaries, or is something deeper calling to her heart?" Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever felt drawn to help someone even when it went against the rules? Meanwhile, in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city, Matthew Bennett was having a similar conversation with his brother David Bennett during their weekly dinner. "You're different," David observed, cutting into his steak and studying Matthew's face. "Happier. More relaxed. Are you seeing someone?" Matthew nearly choked on his wine. "Why would you assume that?" "Because you're actually smiling, for one thing. And you've been leaving the office at reasonable hours instead of staying until midnight every night. Plus, you turned down Mother's dinner party last week, which is basically unprecedented." Matthew set down his fork, considering how much to reveal. David was his business partner as well as his brother, and they'd always been close, but this situation with Sky felt too precious to share, too fragile to expose to outside scrutiny. "I've been talking to someone," he said carefully. "It's complicated." "Complicated how? Is she married?" "No, nothing like that. It's just, we haven't actually met." David's eyebrows rose. "Online dating?" "Not exactly." Matthew ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that David recognized as a sign of his brother's internal struggle. "She works at a crisis counseling center. I called during a panic attack a few weeks ago, and we've been talking regularly since then." "Matthew," David said slowly, "please tell me you're not falling for someone you've never seen." "I don't know what I'm doing," Matthew admitted. All I know is that talking to her is the best part of my day. She doesn't know who I am, doesn't care about the family name or the business. She listens to me. Really listens. And when she talks, I feel like I'm getting to know the most fascinating woman in the world." David was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "What's her name?" "Sky." "And you've really never met her?" "Never even seen a picture. But David, I think I'm falling in love with her voice." The admission hung in the air between them, surprising Matthew with its truth. He was falling in love, had probably already fallen, with a woman he knew only through telephone conversations. It should have felt crazy, should have sent him running in the opposite direction. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard," David said finally, "or the most insane. I'm not sure which." "Maybe both," Matthew said with a rueful smile. As if summoned by their conversation, Matthew's phone rang. The ringtone was different from his usual business calls. He'd programmed a specific tone for the crisis center's number. His heart rate picked up as he glanced at the clock. 11:30. Right on time. "That's her, isn't it?" David asked, noting the immediate change in his brother's demeanor. Matthew nodded, already reaching for the phone. "I need to take this." "Go ahead." "But Matthew? Be careful. I don't want to see you get hurt." Matthew answered the call as David discreetly moved to the living room, giving his brother privacy for what was clearly an important conversation. "Sky," Matthew said, the warmth in his voice unmistakable. "How was your day?" "Better now," she replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "How did your meeting go? The one with the difficult client you were worried about?" The fact that she remembered details from their previous conversations never failed to amaze him. In his world, people barely listened to what he was saying in the moment, let alone retained information from days before. "It went well, actually. I took your advice about listening more and talking less. Turns out the client just wanted to feel heard." "Most people do," Sky said softly. "We all want to know that someone is really paying attention to what we're saying." "Is that what you want, Sky?" Matthew asked, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. "To be heard?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Sky spoke again, her voice was quieter, more vulnerable. "Sometimes I feel like I spend so much time listening to everyone else that I forget what my own voice sounds like." "I love your voice," Matthew said without thinking, then felt heat creep up his neck at the admission. "I love yours too," Sky said softly, saving him from his embarrassment. "It's become the sound I look forward to most." The confession hung between them, charged with possibility and danger. They were crossing lines that neither of them had meant to cross, moving from professional interaction to something much more personal and potentially complicated. "Matthew," Sky said hesitantly, "can I ask you something that might sound strange?" "Anything. Sometimes when we're talking, I close my eyes and try to picture you. Is that weird?" Matthew's breath caught. "What do you see when you picture me?" "Kind eyes," she said without hesitation. "Strong hands that probably gesture when you're explaining something complicated. A smile that you don't use often enough." "What do you see when you picture me?" "Warmth," Matthew said immediately. "Everything about you seems warm. Your voice, your laugh, the way you care about people. I picture someone with expressive eyes and a smile that could light up a room." They were both quiet for a moment, absorbing the intimacy of sharing their imagined versions of each other. "This is crazy," Sky whispered. "Completely insane," Matthew agreed. "But I don't want to stop." "Neither do I." Chapter 2. By the third week of their nightly conversations, Matthew Bennett had become an expert at reading the subtle changes in Sky Price's voice. He could tell when she'd had a particularly difficult shift by the way her words carried a slight weight, could sense her smile even through the phone line, could detect the exact moment when her professional composure melted into personal warmth. Tonight, something was different. "You sound tired," he said after they'd exchanged their usual greetings. "Long day," Sky admitted, rubbing her temples as she settled into her chair at the crisis center. Sasha Price had a college interview today, and I think I was more nervous than she was. How did it go? She thinks it went well, but you know how 17-year-olds are. Everything is either the best thing ever or a complete disaster, with no middle ground. Matthew chuckled, a sound that had become one of Sky's favorite things about their conversations. What's she planning to study? Psychology, with a focus on counseling. She says she wants to help people the way I do, which is both flattering and terrifying. Terrifying why? Sky was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. These conversations with Matthew had become a safe space where she could be completely honest, but talking about her fears for Sasha Price felt like exposing her deepest vulnerabilities. Because this job can break your heart, she said finally. Every day, you carry pieces of other people's pain home with you. You see the worst things humans can do to each other, and sometimes you can't help everyone who calls. Sasha Price is so full of hope and optimism, I don't want this world to dim that light in her. But you're not dim, Matthew said softly. After all the pain you've witnessed, all the people you've helped through their darkest moments, you're still one of the brightest people I've ever known. The compliment hit Sky like a physical touch, spreading warmth through her chest. You can't know that from just talking to me on the phone. Can't I? Matthew's voice dropped to that intimate register that made her pulse quicken. Sky, I know the way you laugh when something genuinely amuses you versus when you're just being polite. I know you hum unconsciously when you're thinking about something serious. I know you care so deeply about people that you probably lie awake at night worrying about callers you spoke to hours ago. How do you know I hum when I'm thinking? Sky asked, surprised. Because you're doing it right now, Matthew said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Sky realized with a start that he was right. She had been humming softly while processing his words. The fact that he'd noticed such a small detail, that he'd been paying close enough attention to learn her unconscious habits, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Outside the crisis center, thunder rumbled ominously, and Sky glanced toward the windows where the first fat drops of rain were beginning to streak the glass. Storm coming, she observed. Here too, Matthew said from his office 43 floors above the city. The weather service is calling for severe thunderstorms all night. As if summoned by his words, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated both of their spaces, followed by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the buildings around them. I should probably warn you, Sky said as the lights in the crisis center flickered ominously, our power grid isn't exactly reliable during storms like this. Mine's pretty solid, Matthew said, but if we get disconnected, I want you to know that these conversations have become the most important part of my day. The vulnerability in his admission made Sky's breath catch. They were treading into dangerous territory, acknowledging feelings that went far beyond appropriate boundaries between a crisis counselor and a caller. But as another flash of lightning illuminated her small office, she found herself caring less about professional protocol and more about the man whose voice had become her anchor. Matthew, she said softly, I need to tell you something. What is it? I've been breaking every rule in the book by continuing these conversations with you. My supervisor, Janet Kim, would probably fire me if she knew I was using the crisis line for personal calls. I don't want to get you in trouble, Matthew said quickly. If you need to stop calling. I don't want to stop, Sky interrupted. That's what scares me. I should want to maintain professional boundaries, should want to follow protocol, but instead I find myself counting down the hours until you call. The storm was intensifying now, rain lashing against the windows with increasing fury. Another flash of lightning was followed immediately by thunder, indicating that the storm was directly overhead. Sky, Matthew said, and something in his voice made her lean closer to the phone, can I confess something to you? Always. I haven't called the crisis line in over a week. I've been calling you directly. Sky blinked in surprise. What do you mean? I mean I figured out the direct number to the crisis center. I've been calling you specifically, not the general crisis line. I know it's probably wrong, and I know it complicates things, but I couldn't risk getting a different counselor. The admission should have alarmed her, should have triggered her professional instincts about inappropriate caller behavior. Instead, she felt a flutter of something that felt suspiciously like joy. He'd been calling specifically for her. How long have you known? She asked. Since the second week. I asked the operator to transfer me to the counselor named Sky, and when she did, I realized I could probably call directly next time. And you didn't think to mention this? I was afraid you'd stop taking my calls if you knew I wasn't following proper protocol. Another massive flash of lightning lit up the night sky, followed immediately by a thunderclap so loud that it seemed to rattle the windows. The lights in the crisis center flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging Sky into darkness. Matthew, she said, her voice slightly shaky, I just lost power. Are you okay? Do you have emergency lighting? Sky fumbled around her desk until she found the small flashlight they kept for power outages. The weak beam barely penetrated the darkness of the office, creating more shadows than light. I have a flashlight, but it's not very bright. The backup generator should kick in soon. But even as she said it, she realized that the familiar hum of the building's electrical systems had gone completely silent. Actually, I think the whole building is out. Do you have somewhere safe to wait until the power comes back? I'm fine, Sky said, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor. I don't love storms, but I'm safe in here. Talk to me, Matthew said, his voice taking on the same soothing quality that Sky used with frightened callers. Tell me what you see. Sky adjusted the flashlight beam, looking around her small office. Shadows, mostly. Everything looks different in the dark. My coffee mug looks like some kind of strange sculpture, and the filing cabinet looks like a monolith. What do you hear? Rain against the windows. Thunder. The wind is really picking up. As if to emphasize her point, a particularly strong gust of wind howled around the building. And I can hear my own heartbeat, which is probably beating a little faster than it should be. Are you scared? Sky considered the question honestly. A little. Not of the storm itself, but of being alone in the dark. It's silly, I know. It's not silly, Matthew said firmly. Fear of the dark is completely natural. When we can't see our surroundings, our minds fill in the gaps with worst-case scenarios. Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Bennett? Sky asked, trying to inject some lightness into her voice. Actually, yes. I minored in psychology before business school. Seemed more interesting than accounting. It was a small detail, but it was one more piece of the puzzle that was Matthew Bennett. Sky found herself collecting these fragments of information about him, building a picture of a man who was far more complex than his corporate exterior suggested. Tell me something else about yourself, she said, settling back in her chair and letting his voice anchor her in the darkness. Something I don't know. Like what? Anything. Your favorite memory, your biggest fear, your secret talent. I want to know you, Matthew. The honesty in her request made Matthew's chest tight with emotion. When was the last time someone had asked about his fears or memories just because they genuinely wanted to understand him better? My biggest fear, he said slowly, is that I'll spend my entire life living up to other people's expectations and never figure out what I actually want for myself. The confession hung in the air between them, charged with vulnerability. Sky could hear the pain underlying his words, the weight of a man who'd been carrying other people's dreams for so long that he'd lost track of his own. What do you think you'd want, she asked softly, if you could want anything? Matthew was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I think I'd want to know what it feels like to be completely understood by someone. To have someone look at me and see who I really am, not who they need me to be. And what would that person see? I don't know, Matthew admitted. That's the terrifying part. I've been playing roles for so long that I'm not sure there's anything authentic left underneath. There is, Sky said with quiet certainty. I can hear it in your voice when you forget to be careful, when you let your guard down. There's a man under all those expectations, Matthew, and he's worth knowing. The power of her conviction reached through the phone line like a lifeline, and Matthew felt something inside his chest loosen and warm. She believed in him, this woman who knew him only through conversations, who had never seen his expensive suits or impressive office or family pedigree. She believed in the person he was when he forgot to be anyone else. Outside, the storm raged with increasing intensity. Lightning flashed almost continuously now, and the thunder had become a constant rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings they occupied. "Sky," Matthew said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to really listen." "I'm listening." "These conversations we've been having, they've changed something in me. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I feel like someone knows me. Really knows me. And I know it's crazy because we've never met, and I know it's inappropriate because of how we connected, but I think I'm falling for you." The admission hit Sky like lightning, electric and illuminating and slightly dangerous. She sat in the darkness, clutching the phone and feeling her world shift around her. "Matthew," she whispered. "I know it's insane," he continued, the words pouring out of him now like water through a broken dam. "I know we're strangers, I know this whole situation is unconventional, but I can't stop thinking about you. I dream about your voice, I find myself saving up stories to tell you during our calls, I've rearranged my entire schedule around these conversations." "Matthew," Sky tried again, but he wasn't finished. "I know you can't feel the same way about someone you've never seen, someone you barely know, but I had to tell you because keeping it inside was killing me." Sky's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed his words. The darkness around her seemed to pulse with possibility and danger, and she realized that she was standing at a crossroads that would change everything. "Matthew," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "you're wrong." "Wrong about what?" "Wrong about me not feeling the same way." The words came out in a rush, like she was afraid she'd lose her courage if she didn't say them quickly. "I do feel the same way. I've been falling for you since that first night when you trusted me with your panic attack. I've been falling for your voice, your laugh, your kindness, the way you remember everything I tell you." The silence that followed was filled with electricity that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. "Sky," Matthew breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I know it's crazy," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I know it goes against everything I've been trained to do professionally. But Matthew, you've become the best part of my day. When you call, it's like the whole world gets brighter." Another flash of lightning illuminated her office, and in that brief moment of light, Sky caught her reflection in the dark computer screen. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her cheeks flushed with emotion. She looked like a woman in love, which was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "What are we going to do?" Matthew asked softly. It was the question that had been haunting both of them for weeks. They were falling in love with voices, with personalities revealed through telephone conversations, with the idea of each other. But reality was more complicated than romance, and they both knew it. "I don't know," Sky admitted. "All I know is that I don't want to stop talking to you. Even if it costs you your job?" Sky thought about Janet Kim, about the crisis center's policies, about the ethical guidelines she'd sworn to uphold when she'd taken this position. Then she thought about the warmth in Matthew's voice, the way he made her feel valued and understood, the connection they'd built across telephone lines and city blocks. "Even then," she said quietly. The storm outside was reaching its peak now, wind howling around the building with such force that Sky could feel the structure swaying slightly. But inside her small circle of flashlight beam, holding the phone that connected her to Matthew, she felt oddly safe. "Tell me something," Matthew said, his voice dropping to that intimate register that made her pulse quicken. "When you close your eyes and listen to my voice, what do you feel?" Sky closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her in the darkness. "Safe," she said immediately. "Like I can tell you anything and you won't judge me for it. Warm, like there's a fire burning somewhere inside my chest. And..." She hesitated, then pushed forward with characteristic honesty, "attracted. Deeply, powerfully attracted to someone I've never seen." "That's what I feel too," Matthew said softly. "Like I'm talking to someone I've been looking for my entire life without knowing it." They were both quiet for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what they'd just confessed to each other. The storm outside provided a dramatic soundtrack to their emotional revelation, thunder punctuating the silence between their words. "Matthew," Sky said hesitantly, "can I ask you something that might sound strange?" "After everything we've just shared, I don't think anything could sound strange. Sometimes when we're talking like this, late at night, I pretend you're here with me. I imagine what it would feel like to have you sitting across from me, or Or what? Or holding me while we talk, she finished in a whisper. Matthew's breath caught audibly. Sky. Is that wrong? To want something I've never had, to miss someone I've never touched? If it's wrong, then I'm guilty of the same crime, Matthew said, his voice rough with emotion. I lie awake after our calls and wonder what it would feel like to see your face when you laugh, to touch your hand, to what? Sky prompted when he trailed off. To hold you close enough that I could feel your heartbeat. The longing in his voice was so palpable that Sky felt tears spring to her eyes. She was crying for the distance between them, for the impossibility of their situation, for the beautiful agony of falling in love with someone who existed only as a voice in the darkness. I wish you were here, she whispered. I wish I could be there. I wish I could hold you through this storm. As if the universe was responding to their conversation, the wind outside suddenly intensified, and something large, a tree branch or piece of debris, crashed against the building with enough force to make Sky gasp. Sky? Are you all right? Something hit the building, she said, her voice shaky. It sounded like it might have been a tree. Is the building structurally sound? Do you need to evacuate? No, it's fine. Just startled me. But even as she said it, another gust of wind rattled the windows with alarming intensity. I hate that you're alone in that storm, Matthew said, frustration evident in his voice. I hate that I can't do anything to help you except talk. Your voice is helping, Sky said truthfully. More than you know. They stayed on the phone for another hour, talking through the worst of the storm. Matthew told her stories about his childhood, about learning to sail with his father before the man died, about the pressure of taking over the family business at 25. Sky shared memories of Sasha Price as a little girl, of the challenges of starting over after her divorce from Philip Dawson, of the satisfaction she found in crisis counseling despite its emotional toll. As they talked, something fundamental shifted between them. The confessions they'd shared had broken down the last barriers of pretense, leaving them emotionally naked and surprisingly comfortable with that vulnerability. They were no longer a crisis counselor and a caller, they were two people who had found something precious and rare in the most unlikely of circumstances. When the power finally flickered back on around 3 in the morning, both Sky and Matthew felt oddly disappointed to lose the intimate darkness that had cocooned their conversation. I should probably go, Sky said reluctantly, noting that Maya Anderson would be arriving soon for her shift. But Matthew? Yes? Thank you. For tonight, for these past few weeks, for making me feel like I matter. You do matter, Matthew said fiercely. You matter more than you know. After they hung up, both Sky and Matthew sat in their respective spaces, staring at their phones and trying to process what had just happened between them. The storm outside was beginning to calm, but the emotional tempest they'd unleashed in each other was just getting started. Sky looked around her office, now brightly lit by the restored fluorescent bulbs, and realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer just fantasizing about a voice on the phone. She was in love with Matthew Bennett, whoever he was, wherever he was. The knowledge was terrifying and exhilarating and completely uncharted territory. 43 floors above the city, Matthew Bennett stood at his office windows, looking out at the storm-washed streets below, and wondered if somewhere in those lights was the woman whose voice had become the soundtrack to his happiness. The woman he was falling in love with, one conversation at a time. The woman he desperately needed to find. But first, they both had to figure out how to navigate a love affair conducted entirely through telephone lines, a connection that existed in the space between voices, in the pause between words, in the dangerous territory of the heart. Chapter 3. 6 weeks had passed since that storm-soaked night when Sky Price and Matthew Bennett had confessed their impossible feelings to each other, and their nightly phone calls had evolved into something that defied every conventional definition of a relationship. They had developed their own language of intimacy, built from shared silences, synchronized breathing, and the way their voices could convey what their bodies could not. Matthew knew the exact tone Sky used when she was smiling, even though he'd never seen her face. Sky could detect when Matthew was stressed by the way his words came just a fraction of a second slower, even though she'd never witnessed his physical tells. Their conversations had become the foundation of their days. Matthew scheduled his business meetings around their 11:30 talks, and Sky found herself arriving at work early just to prepare mentally for the call that had become more important than sleep, food, or any other basic need. Tonight was different, though. Tonight was Christmas Eve, and both of them were alone. Sasha Price had gone to spend the holiday with her father, Philip Dawson, at his new apartment across town, a custody arrangement that left Sky with a quiet house and too much time to think. Matthew had declined his mother's invitation to the Bennett family's traditional Christmas Eve dinner, claiming work obligations that were only half true. The whole truth was that he couldn't bear the thought of sitting through hours of small talk and social maneuvering when all he wanted was to hear Sky's voice. "Merry Christmas Eve," Matthew said when Sky answered the phone at exactly 11:30, as she had every night for the past month and a half. "Merry Christmas Eve to you too," Sky replied, settling into the chair she'd begun thinking of as Matthew's chair, the one she sat in only during their calls, as if it were somehow sacred to their connection. "How are you spending the evening?" Matthew asked, though he could hear in her voice that she was alone. After weeks of conversation, they'd become experts at reading each other's emotional states through subtle vocal cues. "Quiet night at home. Sasha Price is with her father, so it's just me and a cup of hot chocolate that's probably gone cold by now." Sky picked up the mug from her coffee table and confirmed her suspicion. "Definitely cold. What about you? No family obligations?" "I told my mother I was working," Matthew admitted. "Which is technically true, I am working on the most important conversation of my day." The way he said it, with that mixture of humor and sincerity that had become his trademark in their talks, made Sky's chest warm with affection. She closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, letting his voice wash over her like a physical caress. "Matthew," she said softly, "can I tell you something I've never told anyone else?" "Always. Christmas Eve used to be my favorite night of the year when I was married to Philip Dawson. Not because of the gifts or the traditions, but because it was the one night when everything felt possible. Like magic was real and anything could happen." "Used to be?" Matthew prompted gently. "After the divorce, it just became lonely. A reminder of all the traditions I'd lost, all the dreams that didn't work out the way I'd planned." Matthew was quiet for a moment, absorbing the pain in her voice. He'd learned to recognize when Sky was sharing something that cost her emotionally, and he treated these moments with the reverence they deserved. "What changed about tonight?" he asked. "You," she said simply. "Knowing that you're going to call, that we're going to talk, that I have this connection with you, it makes Christmas Eve feel magical again." The confession hit Matthew like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his hands shake slightly as he gripped the phone. He was standing in his apartment, looking out at the city lights that twinkled like earthbound stars, and he realized that Sky Price had given him something he'd never known he was missing: the ability to make someone else's world brighter just by existing in it. "Sky," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "you have no idea what you've given me." "What do you mean?" "Purpose," he said without hesitation. "For the first time in my life, I have something to look forward to that has nothing to do with business or family expectations. I have you to look forward to." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each processing the weight of what they'd shared. Outside Matthew's windows, snow was beginning to fall, light, lazy flakes that caught the city lights and danced in the darkness. In Sky's small apartment, candles flickered on the coffee table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Matthew," Sky said hesitantly, "what would you be doing right now if we had never met?" "Probably working," he said honestly. "Or sitting in my mother's dining room, making polite conversation with people I barely know while thinking about quarterly reports." "That sounds lonely." It was lonely. "I just didn't realize how lonely until I had something to compare it to." "And what do you have to compare it to?" "This," Matthew said simply. "These conversations, this connection we have. The way you make me feel like myself instead of like the person everyone expects me to be." Sky felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. She thought about the man she'd married, Philip Dawson, who had known her for 3 years before they wed but had never once made her feel as understood as this stranger did after 6 weeks of phone calls. "Can I confess something to you?" she asked. "Anything. Sometimes I pretend that this is normal. That having a relationship exist entirely through phone calls is just what people do. Because the alternative, accepting that what we have is impossible, is too heartbreaking to contemplate. What if it doesn't have to be impossible? Matthew asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and terror in equal measure. They'd been dancing around this topic for weeks, both of them carefully avoiding any discussion of meeting in person, of taking their connection beyond the safe boundaries of telephone intimacy. What do you mean? Sky whispered. I mean, what if we found a way to meet? What if we discovered whether this connection we have translates to real life? Sky's heart hammered against her ribs. The thought of meeting Matthew had haunted her dreams and terrified her waking hours in equal measure. What if he was nothing like the man she'd fallen in love with through his voice? What if she disappointed him? What if reality shattered the perfect connection they'd built in the space between phone calls? Are you saying you want to meet me? She asked, her voice barely audible. I'm saying I dream about meeting you, Matthew replied, his own voice dropping to that intimate register that made her pulse quicken. I dream about seeing your face when you laugh, about finding out if your eyes are as warm as your voice suggests, about discovering whether touching you feels as natural as talking to you does. And what if it doesn't? Sky asked, voicing the fear that had been keeping her awake at night. What if we meet and the magic disappears? What if we're better as voices than as people? Matthew was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. It was a valid fear. They both knew that the intimacy they'd built through phone calls was precious and fragile, and exposing it to the harsh light of reality could destroy it completely. Then we'll know, he said finally. And maybe that's better than spending the rest of our lives wondering what might have been. You make it sound simple. It is simple, Matthew said. Terrifying, potentially heartbreaking, probably foolish, but simple. Either what we have is real enough to survive meeting in person, or it isn't. Sky closed her eyes, imagining the man whose voice had become her anchor. She constructed an entire fantasy around him, built from vocal cues and shared conversations, and she was terrified that reality would pale in comparison to her imagination. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I, Matthew said softly. I'm terrified that you'll take one look at me and realize that I'm not the man you thought you were falling for. What if you're disappointed in me? Impossible, Matthew said with such conviction that Sky felt tears spring to her eyes. Sky, I've fallen in love with your mind, your heart, your soul. Whatever you look like, however you move through the world, that's just details. The woman I love is the one who talks me through panic attacks and remembers what I tell her about my difficult clients and makes Christmas Eve feel magical again. The words I love hung in the air between them, the first time either had used that particular phrase. It was a declaration and a question and a leap of faith all rolled into one. I love you too, Sky whispered, and saying it felt like jumping off a cliff and growing wings simultaneously. God, Sky, Matthew breathed, and she could hear the emotion in his voice, relief and joy and overwhelming tenderness. This is insane, she said, but she was laughing through her tears. Completely crazy, Matthew agreed, and she could hear his smile through the phone. But I don't care. I love you, Sky Price. I love you too, Matthew Bennett. They both froze as his last name registered in the conversation. In 6 weeks of intimate talks, they'd carefully avoided surnames, maintaining some last vestige of anonymity even as they'd shared their deepest fears and dreams. Bennett, Sky repeated quietly. That's your last name. Yes, Matthew said, equally quiet. Does that change anything? Sky searched her feelings, examining whether knowing his full name somehow altered her perception of him. It didn't. He was still the man who called her every night, who remembered details about Sasha Price's college applications, who had trusted her with his panic attacks and his family pressures. No, she said finally. You're still you. Matthew Bennett just gives me something concrete to call the man I love. What's your last name? Matthew asked. Price. Sky Price. Sky Price, Matthew repeated, and her name on his lips sounded like music. It's beautiful. It suits you. They talked for another 2 hours, sharing childhood Christmas memories and discussing what it meant to be in love with someone they'd never seen. As the conversation wound down, both of them felt a shift in their relationship. They'd crossed another threshold, moved from falling in love to being in love, from emotional intimacy to declared commitment. "Sky," Matthew said as they prepared to hang up, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer." "Okay. Will you meet me? Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon? Will you take the chance that what we have is real enough to survive the transition from voices to people?" Sky closed her eyes, weighing her fears against her hopes, her need for safety against her desire for authentic connection. She thought about Christmas morning, about waking up alone and wondering what Matthew Bennett looked like when he smiled. She thought about Sasha Price, who was growing up and would soon leave for college, and about the possibility of building a life with someone who truly understood her. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, I'll meet you." "Really? Really? But Matthew? I need time to prepare myself mentally. This is the biggest risk I've ever taken." "Take all the time you need," Matthew said, though she could hear the excitement underlying his patient words. "I've waited 35 years to find you, Sky Price. I can wait a little longer." After they hung up, Sky sat in her candlelit apartment, staring at the phone and trying to process what she'd just agreed to. She was going to meet Matthew Bennett. She was going to risk everything she'd built with him for the chance of something even more extraordinary. It was terrifying. It was thrilling. It was Christmas Eve, and magic felt possible again. Meanwhile, Matthew Bennett stood at his apartment windows, watching the snow fall over the city and knowing that somewhere out there, under the same sky, was the woman he loved. The woman who had agreed to meet him, to take the same terrifying leap of faith that he was prepared to take. For the first time in his adult life, Matthew Bennett was more excited about the future than he was afraid of it. Because somewhere in this vast city was Sky Price, and soon, very soon, he would discover whether the love they'd built through telephone wires could survive the beautiful, terrifying transition to real life. Chapter 4. The Monday morning after New Year's Day arrived with the kind of bone-chilling cold that made Chicago feel like a city carved from ice. Sky Price sat in Janet Kim's office at the Community Crisis Center, watching her supervisor's expression grow increasingly stern as she flipped through what appeared to be phone records. "Sky," Janet Kim said finally, setting the papers down and fixing her with a direct stare, "we need to talk about your call patterns from the past 2 months." Sky's stomach dropped to somewhere around her knees. She'd known this moment might come, had spent sleepless nights preparing for it, but facing the reality of discovery still felt like stepping off a cliff. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, though they both knew she was lying. "I mean the 47 calls from the same number that have lasted an average of 90 minutes each," Janet Kim said, her voice carrying the kind of disappointed authority that made Sky feel like a teenager caught breaking curfew. "I mean the fact that these calls occur consistently at 11:30 p.m., well past the time when most legitimate crisis interventions would be taking place." Sky's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "Those calls are from someone who's been struggling with anxiety and panic attacks. Sometimes crisis support requires building ongoing rapport with." "Don't," Janet Kim interrupted, holding up one hand. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is standard protocol. I've been running crisis intervention programs for 15 years, Sky. I know the difference between appropriate ongoing support and a personal relationship." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Sky felt heat creep up her neck. She'd broken fundamental rules of crisis counseling, had crossed boundaries that existed for good reasons, and now she was facing the consequences. "Janet," she said quietly, "I can explain. I hope you can, because right now I'm looking at grounds for immediate termination." The threat hit Sky like a physical blow. This job wasn't just her livelihood, it was her identity, her purpose, her way of making a difference in the world. The thought of losing it because she'd fallen in love with a voice in the darkness made her feel sick. "The caller, Matthew, he's not in crisis anymore," she said, grasping for some way to make this sound less damaging than it was. "Our conversations have evolved into something more supportive, more therapeutic." "Our conversations," Janet Kim repeated. "Not the crisis intervention sessions or the support calls. Our conversations. Do you hear yourself, Sky?" Sky did hear herself, and she realized how far she'd fallen from professional objectivity. When she talked about Matthew Bennett, her voice softened, her entire demeanor changed. She wasn't talking about a client, she was talking about the man she loved. "I'm recommending you for a formal review," Janet Kim continued. "In the meantime, you're suspended from crisis line duties pending the outcome of that review." "Suspended?" Sky's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Effective immediately. You can continue with your administrative duties, but no more direct client contact until we determine whether you can maintain appropriate professional boundaries." Sky stared at her supervisor, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. No more crisis line duties meant no more late-night calls from Matthew Bennett. It meant their primary connection, the foundation of their entire relationship, had just been severed by professional consequences she should have seen coming. "How long?" she asked. "The review board meets in 3 weeks. Until then, you'll work days, handling intake forms and resource coordination." 3 weeks. 3 weeks without hearing Matthew's voice, without their nightly conversations, without the anchor that had become essential to her emotional well-being. After leaving Janet Kim's office, Sky sat in her car in the crisis center parking lot, staring at her phone and trying to figure out how to explain to Matthew Bennett that their love affair with telephone intimacy had just come to an abrupt end. Meanwhile, across the city at Bennett Investment Group, Matthew Bennett was facing his own crisis of a different kind. "The Hendricks account is threatening to pull their investment," David Bennett said, pacing across Matthew's office like a caged animal. "They're saying we're not giving them the attention they deserve, that you've been distracted and unavailable." Matthew looked up from the quarterly reports he'd been staring at without really seeing. "What do you mean, distracted?" "I mean you've been leaving the office early, declining dinner meetings, and generally acting like you have somewhere more important to be than running a multi-million-dollar investment firm." The accusation was fair, Matthew realized. For the past 2 months, his priorities had shifted dramatically. Business dinners felt like time stolen from his conversations with Sky Price. Client meetings seemed less important than ensuring he was available for their 11:30 calls. He'd been coasting on his reputation and David's hard work, letting his personal life eclipse his professional responsibilities. "I'll talk to Hendricks," Matthew said. "Set up a meeting for this week." "It's not just Hendricks," David said, stopping his pacing to fix his brother with a serious stare. "Mother called this morning. She wants to know why you missed the Charity Foundation board meeting last week." Matthew's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Sarah Bennett's involvement in his professional life was something he'd been trying to minimize for years, but as the primary benefactor of several organizations that did business with Bennett Investment Group, she wielded considerable influence. "I had other commitments," Matthew said carefully. "What commitments? Phone calls with your mystery woman?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with frustration and genuine concern. David had been covering for Matthew's absences, handling clients and managing relationships that should have been Matthew's responsibility. "Her name is Sky," Matthew said quietly. "I don't care what her name is," David replied, though his tone softened slightly. "Matthew, I care about you, but this fantasy relationship is affecting your real life. You're jeopardizing everything we've built because you're in love with someone you've never met." "It's not a fantasy," Matthew said, but even as he said it, he wondered if his brother might be right. What was a relationship that existed only through telephone calls? What was love that had never been tested by physical presence, by the mundane realities of daily life, by any of the challenges that real couples faced? "Then prove it," David said. "Meet her. Stop living in this weird limbo where you're emotionally unavailable to everything else in your life because you're committed to someone who might not even be who she claims to be." The suggestion hit Matthew like cold water. Meet Sky. It was what he'd been wanting for weeks, what they'd agreed to do during their Christmas Eve conversation, but somehow they'd both been finding reasons to postpone the actual meeting. "It's complicated," Matthew said. "Everything's complicated until you make a decision," David replied. "Either this woman is worth restructuring your entire life around, or she isn't. But you can't keep existing in this middle ground where you're not fully present for anything." That afternoon, Matthew tried calling Sky at the crisis center, but was told that she was unavailable and would he like to speak with another counselor? The unfamiliar voice on the other end of the line made him realize how completely his emotional well-being had become tied to one specific person, one particular voice. He tried again that evening, and again the next day, with the same result. By the third day without hearing from Sky Price, Matthew Bennett was beginning to understand what withdrawal felt like. Have you ever had to choose between following your heart and doing what seems right? Tell us in the comments about a time when love complicated your life. Your story might help someone else navigate their own crossroads. Sky was experiencing her own version of withdrawal, made worse by the fact that she couldn't explain to Matthew what had happened. She'd tried calling his office, but Bennett Investment Group's receptionist had informed her that Mr. Bennett was in meetings all day and could she leave a message? The message she wanted to leave: "This is the woman you've been falling in love with through crisis line calls, and I've been suspended for unprofessional conduct," didn't seem appropriate for a business receptionist. By Thursday, both Matthew and Sky were miserable. She was working day shifts that felt foreign and isolating, handling paperwork instead of providing crisis support, counting down the hours until evening when she would sit by her phone hoping for a call that never came. He was going through the motions of his business responsibilities while feeling like half of himself was missing. The breaking point came on Friday evening, when Matthew finally managed to get through to the crisis center during Sky's former shift time. "Crisis support line, this is Maya," a voice said, not Sky's voice, but a voice that sounded familiar somehow. "I'm looking for Sky," Matthew said, abandoning any pretense of anonymity. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Can I ask who's calling?" "This is Matthew Bennett. I've been calling this line regularly to speak with Sky, and I haven't been able to reach her for several days." Another pause, longer this time. "Matthew? The Matthew that Sky has been talking to?" "Yes," he said, surprised by the recognition in the woman's voice. "You know about me?" "Honey, I know more about you than I know about some of my relatives," Maya Anderson said with a mixture of warmth and exasperation. "Sky talks about you constantly." "I'm Maya, her best friend and co-worker." "Where is she?" Matthew asked, relief and anxiety warring in his chest. "Is she all right?" "She's fine, physically." "But Matthew, she's been suspended from crisis line duties because of your calls. Her supervisor found out about the personal nature of your conversations, and now she's facing a formal review that could cost her this job." The words hit Matthew like a sledgehammer. Sky was in trouble, serious, career-threatening trouble, because of their relationship. Because she'd chosen to continue talking to him instead of maintaining professional boundaries. Because he'd been selfish enough to keep calling, knowing that their conversations were blurring the lines of appropriate counselor-client interaction. "Jesus," he breathed. "I had no idea. I never wanted to get her in trouble." "I know you didn't," Maya said, and her voice was gentler now. "But Matthew, you need to understand something. Sky has never, not once in the 3 years I've known her, bent the rules for anyone. She's the most ethical, professional person I've ever worked with. The fact that she risked her career to keep talking to you tells me how much you mean to her." "What can I do?" Matthew asked. "How can I help her?" "I don't know," Maya admitted. "But I think the first step is for you two to stop hiding behind phone calls and actually meet each other. This limbo you're living in isn't sustainable, and it's hurting both of you." "You're right," Matthew said, the clarity of decision cutting through weeks of uncertainty. "You're absolutely right. Can you give me her home number?" "I can do better than that," Maya said. "I can tell you where she'll be tomorrow night." The next evening, Sky Price sat alone at Corner Cafe, the small coffee shop 3 blocks from her apartment where she came when she needed to think. She'd been coming here every night since her suspension, trying to process the wreckage of her professional life and figure out how to rebuild from the ashes. She was staring into her untouched latte when a shadow fell across her table. She looked up, expecting to see the waitress asking if she needed anything else, and instead found herself looking into the most intense blue eyes she'd ever seen. The man standing beside her table was tall, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide the nervous tension in his posture. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch, kind eyes, worried eyes, eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Sky, he said, and the voice that spoke her name was the voice she'd been dreaming about for 2 months, the voice that had become her anchor and her salvation and her downfall all at once. Matthew, she whispered, and saying his name while looking at his face felt like the most natural thing in the world and the most shocking revelation simultaneously. He was real. He was here. And he was everything she'd imagined and nothing like she'd expected and somehow perfect in ways that defied explanation. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You found me," she replied, and realized that they were both crying. Chapter 5. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Matthew Bennett and Sky Price simply stared at each other, the weight of 2 months of telephone intimacy suddenly given physical form. The coffee shop continued its evening rhythm around them, the hiss of the espresso machine, the quiet conversations of other patrons, the gentle jazz music playing overhead, but for Sky and Matthew, the world had narrowed to just this table, this moment, this impossible meeting of souls who had loved each other through voices alone. "May I sit down?" Matthew asked softly, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Sky nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched as he settled into the seat, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he was afraid that sudden motion might shatter the fragile magic of their meeting. Up close, she could see the details that voices could never convey. The way his blue eyes had flecks of silver that caught the cafe's warm lighting, the slight scar on his left temple that spoke of some childhood accident, the way his hands moved with quiet confidence as he placed them on the table between them. But more than the physical details, she could see the vulnerability in his expression, the same emotional openness that had drawn her to him during their first phone call. "You're beautiful," Matthew said, his voice carrying the same wonder that had colored their first conversation. "I mean, I knew you would be, but seeing you." "You're not what I expected," Sky said, then immediately worried that she'd insulted him. "I mean, you're exactly what I hoped for, but different than I imagined. More real, somehow." Matthew smiled, the first full smile she'd seen from him, and Sky felt her heart skip several beats. The warmth she'd heard in his voice was there in his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to genuinely radiant. "I know what you mean," he said. "Hearing your voice for 2 months, I constructed this elaborate fantasy of who you might be. But sitting here, looking at you, it's like the fantasy was just a pale shadow of the reality." They sat in silence for a moment, each absorbing the strange displacement of moving from auditory love to visual confirmation. Everything was the same, his voice still sent shivers down her spine, her laugh still made his chest tight with affection, but everything was also completely different. They were no longer voices in the darkness, they were two people sharing space and air and the soft lighting of a cafe on a January evening. "Matthew," Sky said finally, "I need to tell you what happened. Why I stopped taking your calls." "Maya told me," he said quietly. "About the suspension, about the review." "Sky, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to get you in trouble." "It's not your fault," she said firmly. "I made the choice to keep talking to you. I knew I was breaking rules, and I did it anyway because what we have felt more important than protocol." "Was it worth it?" Matthew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Risking your career for someone you'd never met?" Sky looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the worry lines around his eyes, the way he held himself like he was bracing for rejection, the vulnerability that radiated from every part of his posture. This was the man who had talked her through lonely nights, who had shared his deepest fears and dreams, who had made her believe in love again. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "It was worth it." The relief that washed over Matthew's face was so profound that Sky felt tears spring to her eyes. She reached across the table without thinking, covering his hand with hers, and the contact sent electricity shooting up her arm. "Your hands are warm," she said, surprised by the observation. "I was worried they'd be cold," Matthew admitted. "I'd been nervous all day, knowing I was going to meet you." "How did you find me?" "Maya told me you came here when you needed to think." "I've been sitting in my car across the street for an hour, working up the courage to come inside." The image of Matthew Bennett, successful businessman, confident executive, sitting in his car like a nervous teenager made Sky smile despite the emotional intensity of the moment. "What were you afraid of?" she asked. "Everything," he said honestly. "That you'd take one look at me and realize you'd made a mistake. That the connection we have through phone calls wouldn't translate to real life. That I'd disappoint you somehow. And now? Matthew turned his hand palm up beneath hers, intertwining their fingers with a naturalness that belied the fact that they'd never touched before this moment. Now I think we might have a chance, he said softly. They talked for 2 hours, their conversation flowing with the same ease that had characterized their phone calls, but enriched now by visual cues, the way Sky's eyes sparkled when she laughed, the way Matthew's entire face softened when he talked about his dreams for the future, the way they both leaned forward unconsciously as the evening progressed, drawn together by a magnetism that had only grown stronger with physical presence. As the cafe began to empty around them, signaling the approach of closing time, Matthew reluctantly brought up the practical concerns that had been weighing on his mind. "Sky," he said, "what happens now? With your job, I mean. With the review." Sky's expression grew serious. "I don't know. The review board meets next week. Janet Kim seems to think I have a good chance of keeping my job if I can demonstrate that I understand the boundaries I crossed and have a plan for maintaining professional standards going forward." "And do you? Have a plan?" "I do," Sky said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm going to tell them the truth. That I fell in love with someone I met through the crisis line, that I understand why that was problematic, and that I'm committed to ensuring it never happens again." "Will they accept that?" "I think so. I've been a good employee for 3 years, and this is my first serious disciplinary issue. Janet Kim is tough but fair. She wants to help me learn from this mistake, not destroy my career over it." Matthew was quiet for a moment, processing her words. "What about us? If you keep your job, will there be restrictions on our relationship?" "There might be," Sky admitted. "I might not be allowed to work the crisis line for a while, or I might have additional supervision. But Matthew, even if there are restrictions, they can't tell me who I can love in my personal life." The word love hung in the air between them, as powerful in person as it had been during their Christmas Eve phone call. But now it carried additional weight, the weight of choice, of commitment, of two people deciding to build something real together despite the complicated circumstances of how they'd met. "I love you too," Matthew said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I want to make this work, whatever it takes. Even if it's complicated? Even if people don't understand how we met or why we're together." "Especially then," Matthew said firmly. "Sky, I've spent my entire adult life doing what other people expected of me, living up to standards that other people set. For the first time, I've found something that's completely mine, someone who loves me for who I am, not for what I can provide or what family I come from. I'm not giving that up." As they finally prepared to leave the cafe, Matthew stood and offered Sky his hand. The gesture was old-fashioned and courtly, and when she placed her hand in his, she felt the same electric connection that had characterized their very first phone conversation. "Walk me to my car?" she asked. Outside, the January air was sharp and clean, their breath visible in small puffs of vapor as they walked slowly across the parking lot. Neither of them was in a hurry to end this first meeting, to return to separate spaces and separate lives. At her car, they turned to face each other, and Sky realized that this was the moment when everything would either crystallize into something real or fragment into beautiful memory. "Matthew," she said softly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." "Always. Are you disappointed? Now that you've seen me, now that you know who I really am, do I match the woman you fell in love with over the phone?" Matthew studied her face in the glow of the parking lot lights. Her warm brown eyes that reflected intelligence and compassion, her expressive features that revealed every emotion, the way she held herself with quiet strength despite her obvious nervousness. "Sky," he said, reaching up to cup her face gently in his hands, "you're not a disappointment. You're a revelation. You're everything I hoped for and things I didn't even know I was hoping for." "Really? Really? The woman I fell in love with through phone calls was extraordinary. The woman standing in front of me right now is that same extraordinary person, but more real, more complex, more beautiful than I ever imagined." The sincerity in his voice, the tenderness in his touch, the way he looked at her like she was something precious and rare, it all combined to create a moment of perfect clarity for Sky. This was real. This connection they'd built through telephone wires and shared conversations had not only survived the transition to physical presence, but had been magnified by it. "I love you, Matthew Bennett," she said, the words carrying all the weight of their 2-month journey from strangers to lovers. "I love you too, Sky Price," he replied, and then he leaned down and kissed her. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, a question rather than a statement. But when Sky responded, when she rose up on her toes and deepened the contact, it became something else entirely, a promise, a celebration, a physical manifestation of all the emotional intimacy they'd built through voices alone. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, their faces flushed with more than just the cold air. "Wow," Sky whispered. "Yeah," Matthew agreed, resting his forehead against hers. "Wow." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the parking lot of a neighborhood cafe, two people who had found love in the most unlikely of circumstances and had been brave enough to risk everything to discover whether that love could survive in the real world. It could. It had. And standing there in Matthew's arms, Sky Price knew with absolute certainty that answering one wrong number had led her to exactly the right person. 3 weeks later, Sky sat in the conference room at the Community Crisis Center, facing the review board that would determine her professional future. Janet Kim was there, along with 2 other supervisors and a representative from the organization's board of directors. "Ms. Price," the board representative said, "we've reviewed your case, and we've decided to reinstate you to full duties with the following conditions. You'll undergo additional training on professional boundaries, you'll have monthly supervision meetings for the next 6 months, and you'll be on probation for 1 year." Relief flooded through Sky so powerfully that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. "Thank you," she managed. "I understand the conditions, and I accept them." "We also want to commend you," Janet Kim added, "for your honesty during this process. Your willingness to take responsibility for your actions and your clear commitment to professional growth influenced our decision." After the meeting, Sky walked out of the crisis center with her job intact and her future secured. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she now knew by heart, not the crisis line, but Matthew's direct office number. "Bennett Investment Group, this is Matthew," his familiar voice said. "It's me," Sky said, smiling despite her exhaustion. "I got my job back." "Sky. That's wonderful news. Are you all right? How do you feel?" "Like I can breathe again," she said honestly. "Like I get to keep doing the work I love while also building a life with the man I love." "Speaking of which," Matthew said, and she could hear the smile in his voice, "are you free for dinner tonight? I have something I want to discuss with you." "That sounds ominous," Sky said, though she was still smiling. "Not ominous. Hopeful. Very, very hopeful." That evening, as they sat across from each other at a small Italian restaurant, Matthew reached across the table and took Sky's hand, a gesture that had become natural and necessary in the 3 weeks since their first meeting. "Sky," he said, "I've been thinking about our future, about what we want to build together. And I realized that we've been approaching this backwards. We fell in love before we ever met, we committed to each other before we knew what the other person looked like, we built intimacy through voices before we ever touched." "That's true," Sky said, wondering where he was going with this observation. "So I thought," Matthew continued, reaching into his jacket pocket, "that we might as well continue doing things our own way." He pulled out a small velvet box and placed it on the table between them. Sky's breath caught as she stared at it, her mind racing to process what was happening. "Matthew," she whispered. "I know it's fast," he said quickly. "I know we've only been meeting in person for 3 weeks. But Sky, I've known you for months. I've shared my deepest fears with you, my hopes for the future, my dreams and disappointments. I know how you think, how you feel, how you approach the world. And I know, with absolute certainty, that I want to spend the rest of my life getting to know you even better." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant diamond ring that caught the restaurant's soft lighting and threw it back in brilliant sparks. "Sky Price," Matthew said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "will you marry me?" Sky looked at the ring, at Matthew's hopeful face, at the future that was suddenly spreading out before them like an uncharted map full of possibility. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you, Matthew Bennett." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, as other diners in the restaurant began to applaud, as Matthew leaned across the table to kiss her with all the passion and tenderness that had been building between them for months, Sky realized that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories began with the simplest of mistakes. One wrong number. One answered call. One voice in the darkness that changed everything. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that voice belonged to the person you were meant to spend the rest of your life loving. Have you ever had a connection that started in an unexpected way? What's the most important thing you've learned about finding real love? Share your wisdom with our Dear Love Diaries family. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more passionate love stories that celebrate the beautiful unpredictability of human connection.